Donald Trump threatened to unleash 7,000 soldiers into Chicago despite murders already down 32%, shootings down 40%, and robberies down 35%. Before the eyes of 20 million stunned Americans, Jasmine Crockett smashed her fist on the desk and roared, "This is the most outrageous assault on our Constitution in modern history." The chamber exploded screams, insults, evidence flying like shrapnel. And when Trump's rage erupted, Jasmine delivered a line so brutal it froze Congress in absolute silence. Was this the night one woman saved democracy or the moment America stared into its own collapse? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The announcement hit America like a thunderclap. Donald Trump stood before the cameras, leaned into the microphone, and with a smirk that cut like a blade, declared, "Chicago is a disaster. I will send in 7,000 troops to take it back. No hesitation. No compromise, just raw power, weaponized in front of millions." In that moment, a chill ran through the nation not because of what he said, but because of what it meant. The news cycle detonated within minutes. CNN anchors whispered the word authoritarian. Fox News hailed him as a savior. Twitter ignited with hashtags, #TrumpTroops, #military takeover, #SaveChicago. Supporters celebrated with flags and chants, but others saw tanks rolling into their neighborhoods, soldiers pointing rifles at civilians, the Constitution shredded on live TV. America wasn't debating crime anymore, it was debating survival. And, in a quiet office on Capitol Hill, Jasmine Crockett froze as the screen replayed Trump's words. Her stomach tightened. She knew the truth, the numbers Trump refused to say aloud. Murders down 32%, shootings down 40%, robberies down 35%. Chicago was not a battlefield, it was recovering. What Trump called chaos was progress he couldn't afford politically. To Jasmine, this wasn't about law and order. This was about domination. Her heart pounded, fury boiling inside. She pictured the streets of Chicago under military boots, Humvees outside schools, helicopters drowning out the laughter of children. She heard his words echoing like gunfire, "I will send the troops," and she knew this was more than reckless. This was the most flagrant violation of the Constitution in a generation. Jasmine pushed back from her desk, her reflection flashing in the dark window behind her. Her fists were clenched so tight her knuckles whitened. Anger burned hotter than fear. She whispered, almost like a vow, "You will not terrorize my city. You will not turn my people into enemies of the state." Not while I have a voice. For Trump, it was a performance meant to intimidate. For Jasmine, it was a declaration of war, the kind not fought with soldiers, but with truth, law, and unrelenting courage. She knew this battle would not be quiet. It would be broadcast live, every word, every clash, every insult carved into history. The president wanted to dominate. Jasmine Crockett was ready to confront him head-on, to tear the mask off his fear-mongering in front of the entire nation. The stage was set, the players were chosen. And America braced for a showdown that could either save its democracy or watch it collapse. What happens when a president tries to use the military not to protect, but to dominate? While Trump thundered about a city in chaos, the real voices of Chicago painted a different, visceral picture. Cameras turned to the South Side, where a mother named Denise held up a framed photo of her teenage son. He had been killed 3 years ago in a drive-by shooting, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "Back then, we begged for hope. Today, murders are down 32%. The streets are safer, but he dares to call this a war zone. My son didn't die for soldiers to march past our homes. He died for us to fight for change." Her words, broadcast live, cut deeper than any statistic. In another neighborhood, a youth activist named Marcus stood before a crowded community center. Just 19, he had seen friends lost to violence, but he now ran a program funded by city reforms that kept kids off the streets. "Shootings are down 40%, he declared, his voice breaking but determined. "We are proof that investing in people works, yet Trump wants to roll in tanks. That's not saving us, that's erasing us." The room erupted in applause, defiance, mixing with grief, the kind of applause that dared the world to ignore them. On the West Side, pastors, teachers, and community leaders gathered at a church still marked by bullet holes from years past. Reverend Thompson, his voice echoing beneath stained glass, thundered into the microphone, "Robberies are down 35%. Our neighborhoods are rising, our people are rebuilding. This is not a battlefield, it's a community clawing its way back to life, and we will not allow a president to stomp it down with combat boots. His words were met with cries of amen, but beneath the faith was fury, the kind that simmered in silence until provoked. For Jasmine Crockett, these testimonies were more than headlines. They were lifelines. She watched the broadcasts from her office, each face etched into her memory: the grieving mother, the determined teenager, the defiant preacher. They weren't statistics on a chart, they were proof that Trump's narrative was a lie designed to weaponize fear. She could almost hear Trump's voice again, sneering about beautiful black women begging him to come, and the thought made her stomach twist. These women weren't begging, they were resisting. They weren't pleading for troops, they were demanding justice. Jasmine scribbled notes furiously, her pen nearly tearing the paper. She underlined the numbers 32%, 40%, 35% and circled them again and again, as if engraving them into her strategy. But more powerful than the ink were the faces burned into her mind. Every story was a bullet of truth she would fire back when the moment came, and that moment was coming fast. Trump framed Chicago as a battlefield. But Jasmine knew the truth. Chicago wasn't a battlefield, it was ground zero in a larger war for America's soul. These voices weren't just testimonies. They were the spark that could ignite a national reckoning. And as she pushed away from her desk, fire rising in her chest, Jasmine whispered to herself, "When I step into that chamber, I won't be speaking alone. Chicago will be speaking through me." The testimonies from Chicago still echoed in Jasmine Crockett's mind when she returned to her desk. Denise's trembling voice, Marcus's fiery words, the preacher's defiance, they weren't just stories, they were ammunition. Jasmine knew Trump wouldn't stop. He had declared war on truth itself, and now he was weaponizing the military against American citizens. To face him, she needed more than anger, she needed precision, law, and allies who wouldn't flinch. When the storm hit, her office transformed into a war room overnight. Piles of constitutional texts and legal precedents covered her table. She read until her eyes blurred, scribbling notes in the margins. The 10th Amendment states rights, the Posse Comitatus Act limits on federal troops, Federalist Papers warnings against tyranny. Every clause felt like a shield, every precedent a sword. Each late-night coffee, each page turned, sharpened her into something more than a congresswoman. She was becoming a strategist, preparing to prosecute the most powerful man in America, in front of the entire world. But she knew she couldn't do it alone. Governor J.B. Pritzker called in from Illinois, his voice steady but burning with frustration. "There is no emergency here. Trump is manufacturing chaos. If he tries to federalize our National Guard, we'll fight it all the way to the Supreme Court." His commitment steadied her. Then came a visit from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, fierce as ever, slamming her hand on Jasmine's desk. "They'll call you names, they'll drown you in lies, but if you bring the receipts, if you bring the truth, they won't be able to bury it." Jasmine nodded, her resolve hardening. Together, they mapped out not just arguments, but strategy. How to counter every insult with fact, every shout with proof. Civil rights leaders soon joined the circle, their presence reminding Jasmine of the generations that had fought before her. Reverend Al Sharpton leaned in and said quietly, "This isn't just about Chicago. This is Selma with microphones. This is history knocking at your door. Answer it with fire." Jasmine felt a shiver, not of fear, but of destiny. She wasn't just preparing for a hearing, she was preparing for a battlefield disguised as a congressional chamber. And whispers spread quickly through Washington's marble halls. A historic hearing was coming. Staffers murmured that it would be broadcast live to tens of millions, that it could become one of the most explosive confrontations in American political history. Reporters began circling, hungry for sound bites, cameras ready to catch a nation on edge. The atmosphere thickened like the air before a storm. Everyone knew something seismic was about to erupt. As the clock ticked past midnight, Jasmine stood before her team, exhaustion written on their faces, a fire burning in their eyes. She slammed her hand on the desk, documents scattering like sparks. "If Trump wants a war on democracy, I'll fight it in front of the whole nation. And I will not lose." The room fell silent. They all felt that this was no longer politics. This was survival. Do you believe facts can defeat raw power? In today's America, or are we witnessing the moment truth itself goes on trial? The hearing room was already charged like a light wire when Donald Trump strode to the microphone. Cameras zoomed in as he leaned forward, his lips curling into that trademark sneer. He didn't bother with policy or pretense. He went straight for the kill. "She's incompetent," he barked, jabbing a finger in Jasmine Crockett's direction. "Grossly incompetent." The words cracked across the chamber like a whip. MAGA loyalists in the audience erupted into cheers, red hats waving in a sea of defiance, their chants drowning the silence that had gripped the room only seconds earlier. Trump relished the no's, his smirk widening as he raised a hand to quiet them, only to drive the knife deeper. "Beautiful black women," he drawled with faux sincerity, "are begging me to send the military. They come to me, tears in their eyes, pleading for safety. They're wearing red hats, they're proud Americans, and they know only I can save them." The chamber convulsed, half gasping in outrage, half roaring in approval. To some, it was charisma. To others, it was poison. On Twitter, hashtags detonated in real time. Hashtag incompetent, hashtag racist dog whistle, hashtag Trump vs Crockett. CNN Nankus whispered into live coverage, calling his remarks unprecedented and inflammatory. Fox commentators framed it as bold truth-telling. And in living rooms across America, families sat stunned, watching the President of the United States weaponize race, gender, and fear with every syllable. Jasmine sat motionless, her hands folded tightly on the desk before her. To the cameras, she appeared calm, but inside her chest, her heart thundered like a war drum. Each word he spit was more than an insult. It was an attempt to erase her, to reduce her to a caricature for his audience to mock. But she didn't flinch. She let him speak, let him unleash the full spectacle, because she knew the more he revealed his contempt, the more the nation would see the truth about him. Trump turned to the committee with a grin, as if daring them to object. "Chicago is a battlefield," he proclaimed. "And I'm the only general willing to win it." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Some lawmakers shook their heads in disbelief. Others whispered furiously into aides' ears. It wasn't just rhetoric, it was a declaration that American cities could be treated as war zones, their citizens as enemies to be subdued. The tension thickened until it was suffocating. Jasmine's pen tapped once, twice, against her folder. The cameras caught her eyes narrowing, her breath steadying, her resolve hardening. Across the room, Trump's grin faltered for just a flicker when he saw she wasn't rattled. The audience didn't know it yet, but the stage had shifted. Trump had struck first, viciously and without restraint. But Jasmine Crockett was cold like a spring, ready to unleash not just fury, but facts sharp enough to cut through his performance. This was no longer a hearing. It was a battlefield disguised in marble and microphones, and the first shots had been fired. For a moment after Trump's tirade, the chamber throbbed with nose cheers, boos, frantic whispers, the chair's gavel hammered for order. But it was Jasmine Crockett's rising figure that finally cut through the chaos. She pushed back her chair, the scrape echoing like steel on concrete, and walked deliberately to the microphone. The cameras locked onto her, the nation holding its breath. Her voice sliced through the tension like a blade. "Mr. President, you call Chicago a battlefield. You call me incompetent. But here's the truth you will not speak. Violent crime in Chicago is down by nearly half. Murders down 32%, shootings down 40%, robberies down 35%. The only crisis in this chamber is you manufacturing fear to justify power grab." Gasps rippled across the chamber. Reporters' pens froze mid-sentence. The statistics hung in the air like explosives, undeniable and devastating. The MAGA section hissed, while Democrats erupted into applause before the gavel slammed again. For silence, the tension was unbearable, every eye darting between Trump's smoldering glare and Jasmine's unflinching stance. That was when Jim Jordan shot to his feet, red-faced, his voice cracking as he shouted, "Fake news, lies, Chicago is burning and everyone knows it." His words collided with the air like shrapnel. The room quaked with murmurs, the divide sharper than ever. Jasmine didn't miss a beat. She leaned forward, eyes blazing, and snapped back so hard it rattled the chamber. "Jim, you're nothing but a microphone for Trump. You don't speak truth, you echo propaganda." The chamber exploded. Some gasped, some roared approval, others shouted in protest. Even the chair looked stunned, gavel frozen in his hand. The clash wasn't just political, it was personal, raw, and unfiltered. Jasmine's words had shattered the ritual politeness of Congress and laid bare the fury simmering beneath. Trump slammed his hand on the table, his face crimson, his jaw tight as he muttered under his breath, caught by a hot mic, "She regret this," but Jasmine didn't flinch. She stared him down, her voice rising, resolute. "No, Mr. President, it's you who will regret underestimating the people of Chicago, the Constitution, and me." The camera zoomed in. Jasmine's eyes burned with conviction, while Trump's flickered with rage. The chamber had become an arena, and every American watching knew they weren't witnessing a routine hearing. They were watching a duel, a battle of wills that would decide more than just political points. It would decide whether facts could still stand against the brute force of power. And as the gavel finally pounded for order, Jasmine's words echoed across the chamber, across the airwaves, across the nation, a declaration not just of defiance, but of war. This was no longer Trump versus a congresswoman. This was truth versus tyranny, and America was now on the front row of history. The chamber quaked under the weight of voices. Shouts collided from every corner, Democrats pounding the desks in support, Republicans barking insults, aides scrambling with papers, reporters scribbling furiously as if history were spilling too fast to capture. The chair's gavel hammered again and again, the echo booming like gunfire. Order, order, but no one was listening. America was watching chaos unfold in real time, and the chaos had a face. Trump leaned forward, his voice dripping venom, eyes locked on Jasmine. "You're nothing but political trash," he spat, each word carrying the sting of humiliation meant for a national audience. The insult hung in the air, heavy and toxic. Gasps cut through the chamber, but before the shock could settle, Jasmine shot to her feet. Her voice thundered back, sharp, deliberate, every syllable hitting like a hammer. "No, Mr. Trump, you are the trash that pollutes our Constitution, the poison that eats away at the foundation of our democracy." The chamber exploded. One side roared approval, the other shrieked with outrage. A congressman shouted out of order, but Jasmine didn't blink. She stared straight at Trump, her defiance blazing on the big screen as millions at home leaned forward, transfixed. Reporters would later write that in that moment, it was no longer a hearing, it was a duel, a collision of two Americas fighting for dominance under the Capitol dome. Trump slammed his palm against the desk so hard water glasses rattled. His face flushed deep crimson, sweat glistening under the lights. "I don't need permission. I don't need approval. If I want troops in Chicago, I'll send them whether you like it or not." His fist came down like a judge's verdict, a sound that reverberated through the chamber and through the nation. The silence that followed was electric, more terrifying than the shouting that came before. Jasmine leaned closer, her voice low but sharp enough to cut. "And there it is, not law, not justice, just raw power. You admit it yourself, you want to rule by fear, not by the Constitution." Her words carved through the silence, and suddenly the chamber felt less like Congress and more like a courtroom where the accused had just confessed. Trump supporters erupted, chanting "USA, USA," as if volume alone could erase the truth. But Jasmine's allies rose too, chanting back "Constitution, Constitution." The sound collided in a cacophony that shook the chamber to its core, a battle hymn for a democracy teetering on the edge. The chair's gavel thundered desperately for order, but the spectacle could no longer be contained. The clash had transcended politics, it was raw survival. The president had promised unchecked force. The congresswoman had called him out as a tyrant. And America, watching on every screen, was left with a chilling question hanging in the air. Like smoke after an explosion, should a president have unlimited power over the military, or is this how democracies fall? The chamber was still vibrating from Trump's fist when Jasmine Crockett rose again, this time not with fire in her eyes, but with a folder clutched tightly in her hand. She walked to the microphone with the steadiness of a surgeon approaching. The operating table, camera zoomed in, the red recording lights burning like eyes of the nation. Millions leaned closer to their screens, sensing something seismic was about to erupt. She snapped the folder open, pulled out a stack of documents, and her voice cut through the storm like a scalpel. "Mr. President, you call Chicago a battlefield. You say our city is collapsing. But here is the truth you don't want America to hear." She held up the first page, numbers bold and undeniable. Homicides down 32%. Shootings down 40%. Robberies down 35%. The clearance rate for violent crime 76 to 77%, the highest in over a decade. "These are not fantasies, these are facts," gasps erupted across the chamber. Reporters' cameras clicked like machine guns, capturing every angle of the moment. Screens around the country flashed charts and graphs, fact-check banners confirming her words in real time. The contrast was devastating. Jasmine wielding truth like a weapon, Trump cornered by the very reality he had tried to erase. Trump's lips tightened, his jaw working furiously as he gripped the desk, but Jasmine didn't give him space to breathe. You tell America that Chicago is in ruins, but the numbers prove progress. You claim people are begging for troops, but the only thing they're begging for is investment in schools, in jobs, in housing. Mr. President, you are not saving America. You are strangling it with lies. The room convulsed with reaction applause, clashing with boos, cheers colliding with shouts. The chair's gavel slammed, but no one heard. This wasn't order. This was war, fought with words and evidence in front of the entire nation. Trump slammed his palm against the table again, his face a mask of fury, but Jasmine turned and held up another sheet, her voice growing sharper, louder, resonant with every syllable. These numbers come from the Chicago Police Department itself. These are their official records, not partisan spin. For once, the facts are louder than your fear. Cameras zoomed in tight on her hands, shaking the paper. On Trump's face twitching with barely contained rage. On the gallery above where citizens leaned forward with wide eyes. The tension was suffocating, every breath in the chamber heavy with the realization that truth had just been thrown like a grenade into the middle of the room. For a fleeting second, silence fell, stunned, raw, electric. It was the kind of silence that came not from peace, but from the shockwave after an explosion. And then Jasmine leaned in, her voice dropping lower, calmer, deadlier. So tell us, Mr. President, if the facts prove you wrong, why are you so desperate to send in troops? What are you really fighting for? The question detonated harder than any statistic. The chamber froze, the nation froze, and all eyes turned to Trump, waiting to see if he could answer or if silence would damn him louder than words ever could. The chamber hadn't even recovered from the shock of Jasmine's statistics when she reached back into her folder, her hand pulling out a single document marked in bold red ink. She held it high, her voice rising with a force that demanded silence. And if facts weren't enough, let me show you the proof of what this president has done behind the curtain. Cameras zoomed, audiences leaned forward, and the entire hearing seemed to pause, waiting for the strike. Her words dropped like thunder. Donald Trump cut $800 million from federal programs designed to prevent violence, to stop shootings before they happen, to keep kids alive in our streets. A wave of gasps ripped through the chamber. Reporters scrambled, fingers flying over keyboards as breaking news alerts exploded across screens. Crockett drops $800 million bombshell. Jasmine's voice grew sharper, her tone a mixture of fury and heartbreak. He takes food off families' tables, rips medicine from their cabinets, slashes jobs and youth programs, and then he dares to send soldiers to our neighborhoods. Soldiers with guns where schoolbooks should be, tanks instead of teachers, helicopters instead of hope. The gallery erupted, citizens in attendance shouting, some in tears, their voices echoing through the marble walls. Trump shook his head violently, muttering lies, fake, fake, but the hot mic betrayed his panic. His knuckles whitened as he gripped the desk, jaw clenched so tightly, looked ready to crack. Yet Jasmine didn't give him space to breathe. She slammed the papers down on the table so hard it echoed like a gavel. This isn't fake. These are your own budget numbers. Your signature is on a line that gutted $800 million from programs that save lives. You starved communities and then blamed them for their hunger. You created pain and now you sell yourself as the cure. The room erupted into chaos. Democrats pounded the desks in support. Republicans shouted over them. The chair's gavel hammered furiously to restore order. But there was no order left. The hearing had become a battleground of raw truth and raw rage, broadcast into millions of homes, where Americans sat in stunned silence or shouted at their screens. On CNN, anchors broke in with urgent analysis. This is the first time the $800 million cut has been tied directly to the Chicago violence narrative. On Fox, the spin was instant. Partisan theater at its worst. Social media exploded with hashtags, hashtag 800 million, hashtag Crockett exposes Trump, hashtag blood money. The story wasn't just about Chicago anymore, it was about betrayal, about a president accused of pulling resources from the vulnerable only to tighten control with military force. Jasmine leaned closer to the microphone, her voice lower now, steady as stone. "You cannot starve a city and then call it broken. You cannot strip away its defenses and then declare it unworthy of survival. You cannot destroy hope and then disguise yourself as its savior." Her eyes locked on Trump, unwavering. "This is not leadership. This is sabotage." The chamber fell silent, stunned into stillness. For the first time, Trump's bravado faltered under the weight of documented truth. And as the nation watched, one thought reverberated louder than the gavel, louder than the chants, louder than the chaos. If this was true, then the President of the United States had not merely failed his people, he had betrayed them. The chamber was already on fire from the $800 million revelation when Trump finally snapped. He rose from his seat so violently the chair skidded back with a screech, his fist hammering the table until glasses rattled. His face burned crimson, sweat beading across his forehead under the harsh lights. His voice thundered, raw and unhinged. "I am the president. I have absolute power." The words tore through the hall like a bomb, silencing even his own allies for a beat. It wasn't a statement, it was a roar of domination, a claim to kingship dressed in the mouth of a man sworn to democracy. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Some lawmakers stared in disbelief, others smirked in approval, but everyone felt the tremor of the moment. The gavel pounded desperately for order, order, order. Yet the sound was drowned by the echo of Trump's declaration. Across the country, living rooms and still, screens glowing as Americans watched their leader lay claim to something no president had dared to say aloud. The words absolute power hung in the air like poison. And then Jasmine stood. No hesitation, no fear. Her voice cut through the chaos, low at first, but sharpened to a blade. "Absolute power belongs only to dictators. In America, we have a constitution." The chamber erupted again, one side booing, the other side roaring in applause. The contrast was deafening, to Americas colliding in one room, the sound of democracy under siege. Trump's glare locked onto Jasmine, his chest heaving as though each breath carried more fury than the last. "You don't understand strength," he bellowed. "You don't understand what it takes to control a city like Chicago. Weak leaders hide behind papers and laws. Strong leaders take action." He slammed his palm down again, voice shaking. With rage, "If the guard isn't enough, then I'll send active duty troops. Marines, soldiers, whatever it takes. And there's nothing you can do to stop me." The room convulsed. Gasps turned into shouts. Reporters bolted from their chairs to file breaking news. "Trump threatens active troops in Chicago." Lawmakers shouted over one another. The gallery erupted into chaos, citizens crying out as the nightmare scenario became. Words spoken on live television, tanks in American streets, soldiers on patrol against their own people. Division was no longer hypothetical, it was promised. Jasmine leaned forward, her hand gripping the microphone as if anchoring herself against the storm. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with fire. "There it is, the truth, for all America to see. Not protection, not safety. Power raw, unchecked, and dangerous. You don't want order, Mr. President, you want obedience." Her words hung like a sentence pronounced in court, slicing through the nose. For the first time, Trump faltered. His mouth twisted, his jaw clenched, but there was no retreat. In his eyes only rage, only threat. The chamber seemed to shrink around them, to figures locked in a duel while the world looked on. And as the gavel pounded helplessly, the question that gripped every American watching was no longer about crime or politics. It was something far darker, more urgent, more terrifying. What's more dangerous, crime in the streets or tyranny in the White House? The hearing room, already stretched to its breaking point, fell into a new kind of silence as the first constitutional expert adjusted his glasses and leaned into the microphone. His voice was calm, deliberate, but each word cut like a scalpel through the chaos. "Mr. President, under the 10th Amendment, states reserve the right to control their National Guard unless federalized in times of true emergency. There is no such emergency in Illinois. You have no constitutional authority to federalize the Illinois National Guard. None." Murmurs rippled across the chamber, reporters scribbling furiously, cameras zooming in to catch every flicker of Trump's face. The expert continued, his tone unshaken. "Your threats to deploy active duty troops into Chicago are not only unconstitutional, they are a violation of the very oath you swore to uphold." Gasps broke out. The weight of the words fell like stones, heavy and damning, echoing beyond the walls of Congress into every home tuned in laugh. But before the silence could settle, Trump slammed both hands on the desk and leaned forward, his voice cracking like thunder. Fake judges, academic trash, you don't understand strength, you don't understand America. Only I do. His words drip venom, contempt boiling over into insult. He jabbed a finger at the panel of experts. You hide behind your books and papers while people die in the streets. You're nothing but cowards pretending to be wise. The chamber erupted in chaos. Lawmakers shouted over one another, some pounding their fists on tables, others demanding the chair restore order. The gavel hammered again and again. Order, order. But Trump's voice bulldozed through it all. I am the president. You are nobodies. I will decide what the Constitution means. The words landed like an earthquake. The gallery erupted into cries of outrage. Journalists whispered to one another, already drafting the headline, Trump claims power to redefine Constitution. Jasmine sat motionless for a beat, her eyes locked on him, as if studying the anatomy of tyranny in real time. Then she rose, her voice slicing through the uproar. You do not decide what the Constitution means, the Constitution decides what you mean. And right now, it defines you as a man out of control. The chamber shook with applause and fury in equal measure. Supporters of Trump screamed back, calling it a witch hunt, while others stood to cheer Jasmine's defiance. The legal experts nodded solemnly, their testimony now framed not just as academic truth but as a shield in the line of fire. Trump's face contorted, his fist pounding the table. Once more, spit flying as he snarled, You think the law will stop me? Watch me. Watch what happens next. The air turned electric, the chamber choking on the collision of law and raw power. And as cameras zoomed tighter, the question echoing across America was no longer whether Trump had authority, it was whether the Constitution itself could survive a president who openly declared war against it. The legal clash still echoed in the chamber when the chair called the first witness. A woman in her early 40s stepped forward, clutching a framed photograph so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her voice trembled at first, but the grief in her words was unmistakable. This is my son, Malik. He was 15 when he was shot walking home from school. That was 3 years ago. I buried him before I ever saw him graduate. The chamber fell silent. Reporters lowered their pens. Even the most hardened lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She steadied herself, tears streaking her cheeks. We didn't need soldiers back then. We needed counselors, teachers, after-school programs. Jobs for the kids in our neighborhood. My boy needed a safe classroom, not a Humvee parked outside his window. We need jobs and schools, not soldiers. Her words cracked through the silence, louder than any gavel. Jasmine's eyes welled, and for a brief moment, her mask of composure slipped. A single tear broke free, glistening under the lights. Another mother followed, holding a small pair of basketball shoes in her hands. Her son's dream had been the NBA. She clutched them to her chest like armor, her voice trembling with rage. Mr. President, you say Chicago is a battlefield. Then who is the enemy? My son? My neighbors? The children who just want to play ball without hearing gunshots. You cut funding that could have saved him, and now you want to send soldiers where he once practiced free throws. That's not leadership, that's cruelty. The chamber quaked with emotion. Jasmine pressed her hand to her lips, swallowing the lump in her throat. She broke. Just for a moment her shoulders sagged, her eyes closed, but then she straightened, wiping the tear away, her jaw tightening again like steel. The camera zoomed in, catching that transformation. America saw not weakness, but resilience forged in empathy. A community pastor took the stand, his voice booming under the high ceilings. We have buried too many. We don't need rifles on our streets. We need resources in our schools. The people of Chicago are not enemy combatants. They are citizens, mothers, fathers, children forgotten by their president until he decided to use us as props in his theater of fear. The audience erupted, some shouting amen, others crying opally. Trump sat rigid, arms crossed, his face twisted in disdain. But Jasmine leaned forward, her eyes never leaving the witnesses, her hands scribbling notes furiously as if etching their pain into her very bones. When the pastor finished, Jasmine rose just enough to address the room, her voice low but steady. This is the cost of his policies, not statistics. Not sound bites, lives, families, futures. The chamber was heavy with silence, as if the marble itself had absorbed the sorrow. And into that silence, a question burned louder than shouts, sharper than any gavel. If this was the price of Trump's power, how much more was America willing to lose? The testimonies still hung heavy in the air, but Trump had no patience for grief. He shot to his feet, his chair crashing backward, his voice breaking through the chamber like an explosion. "I'll crush Chicago and anyone who gets in my way." The words were less policy and threat, a dictators were masquerading as presidential authority. His fists slammed the desk, the sound reverberating through the marble walls like a judge's gavel of war. The chamber convulsed. Some Republicans leapt to their feet, clapping wildly, while Democrats erupted in fury. The chair's gavel pounded helplessly, drowned by the chaos. Journalists scrambled, their headlines writing themselves, "Trump threatens to crush American city." The gallery gasped, some shouting in disbelief, others weeping openly. The temperature of the room seemed to rise, each second suffused with the raw heat of history unfolding. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, deliberately, the kind of rise that sent cameras swiveling and every whisper dying in her wake. She walked forward, closing the distance, until she stood just inches from Trump. The two figures faced off under the glare of the lights, the embodiment of two visions of America locked in combat. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of steel and fire. "Try me. You'll lose." The room froze. Gasps turned into silence. The words weren't shouted, they were delivered with surgical precision, sharp enough to cut through Trump's bluster and pierce directly into his armor. For a moment, the air seemed to hold its breath, Trump's face twisted, rage and disbelief colliding. His mouth opened, but no words came out, and then the cameras caught it a twitch. A tiny, involuntary flicker near his left eye, gone in an instant but captured in high definition, replayed and magnified across every screen in America. For the first time, the mask of invincibility cracked. It wasn't just anger now. It was fear. The silence in the chamber was suffocating, the kind that makes every heartbeat sound like a drum. Lawmakers stare, unsure if they had just witnessed the beginning of Trump's unraveling or the spark of something darker. Social media detonated in real time. #TryMe, #ULLLose, #TrumpTwitch. Millions posted the freeze frame of that tiny twitch, dissecting it like evidence from a crime scene. But Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't blink. She leaned closer, her eyes locked on his, her words almost a whisper, but sharp enough to cut glass. "This isn't about me, Mr. President. This is about the people you swore to serve, and if you turn America's army against them, history will remember you not as a leader, but as a tyrant who was finally stopped." The chamber erupted again, shouts, applause, protests colliding into a storm. The gavel pounded, but the sound was lost. What lingered wasn't the noise, it was the image of a president trembling on the edge, and a congresswoman standing firm in his shadow. And as the screen faded to black for millions watching at home, one question seared itself into the nation's conscience, impossible to ignore. Would you risk everything to defend democracy? The tension from the last exchange still hung like smoke in the chamber when Trump suddenly lurched forward, gripping the microphone with both hands as if it were the last weapon left to him. His face was flushed, eyes blazing with a mix of rage and desperation. He didn't even attempt a veneer of policy, now only raw insult. "Trash," he spat, his voice booming off the marble walls. "Puppet, clown, that's what you are, Jasmine Crockett. A clown dancing for the cameras, a puppet for the radicals, trash pretending to be a leader." The words dripped with venom, sharpened not to persuade but to wound. Gasps tore through the audience. Some of his allies laughed, clapping like hyenas at their alpha's cruelty, while others shifted uncomfortably, realizing how nakedly unhinged it sounded. The gavel pounded, but the sound was drowned beneath Trump's tirade. He leaned closer to the mic, lowering his voice into a growl that carried an even darker edge. "You don't belong in this chamber. You don't belong in this country's story. You're nothing but noise." For a moment, silence. Jasmine stood completely still, her eyes locked on him, her hands resting lightly on the table. But the stillness was not weakness, it was cold energy. And then she rose, slowly, deliberately, letting the silence stretch until every camera zoomed in, every viewer leaned forward. Her voice was calm at first, but carried the weight of steel. "You can call me trash, you can call me a clown, you can call me a puppet, but hear me clearly. I would rather be a puppet for justice than a dictator for greed." the chamber detonated. Applause thundered from her allies, shouts of outrage from Trump's loyalists, while the gallery exploded with cheers and gasps. The gavel pounded furiously, but the sound was swallowed in the storm. Trump's face froze, caught between rage and disbelief, as if the words had cut deeper than he expected. Jasmine stood taller, her presence commanding the room like a general, rallying her troops beyond the chamber. The internet ignited instantly. Twitter trended with hashtags, #puppet for justice, #dictator for greed, #Crockett clap back. Memes flooded timelines. Trump has a marionette tangled in his own strings, Jasmine holding the Constitution like scissors, ready to cut him loose. TikTok clips replayed her words with dramatic music overlays, gaining millions of views within minutes. Across living rooms, bars, and college campuses, people repeated her line as if it were already etched into history. Trump snarled into the microphone, his fists trembling, but Jasmine raised her hand, silencing him with nothing more than her composure. "You think insults make you strong? No, Mr. President, they make you small. They reveal the fear behind your power." Her words lingered, sharp, undeniable, resonating far beyond the chamber, and as the gavel struggled to regain control, the nation knew it had just witnessed something unforgettable, not just a battle of insults, but a revelation of character. One side wielded slurs, the other wielded truth. The question now burned hotter than ever, one the cameras couldn't stop replaying. Was this the moment Trump's words finally betrayed him, or the moment Jasmine's courage began rewriting America's story? The chamber was still reverberating from Jasmine's line when another voice cut through the storm. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez rose from her seat, fire blazing in her eyes. She pointed straight at Trump, her words like arrows. "You call her a puppet. You call her trash. Let me tell you what trash is. Trash is slashing schools, slashing healthcare, slashing jobs, then pretending you care about families while you roll tanks through their neighborhoods." Her voice climbed higher, every word sharpened by fury. "And let me remind you, the Constitution is not your tote. It belongs to the people, and we're here to defend it." Applause thundered, Democrats rising to their feet, while Republicans shouted in protest. The gavel slammed again and again, but the momentum had shifted. Ayanna Pressley stood next, her tone colder, sharper, a blade of ice cutting through Trump's bravado. "Mr. President, your words are violence. Your policies are violence, and this violence is not abstract. It is paid in blood by the mothers we heard today. This isn't leadership, this is cruelty wrapped in red, white, and blue." Trump's face flushed deeper, his fists trembling, but the room no longer belonged to him. Civil rights leaders seated in the gallery stood and raised their voices, chanting justice, justice. The chamber quaked with sound, the marble walls straining to contain the clash. The cameras swiveled, catching every angle, every chant, every raised fist. America was not watching a hearing anymore, they were watching a movement. "Rise." And then Governor J.B. Pritzker's voice boomed through the microphone, steady and deliberate, cutting through the roar. "This is not law and order. This is lawlessness in the White House." The words landed like a thunderclap. The chamber stilled for a heartbeat, then erupted again, louder, raw. Headlines flashed instantly. "Pritzker calls White House lawless." Outside the chamber, the media war escalated. MSNBC anchors leaned forward, voices trembling with urgency. "What we are witnessing is historic." Elected officials, mothers, civil rights leaders all uniting against an authoritarian threat. Meanwhile, Fox News framed it differently, rallying their base with soundbites of Trump's threats, calling him a strong leader standing up to chaos. The ratings war was on. Two networks locked in a duel mirroring the split inside the chamber, each narrative battling for the soul of America. Back in the hearing, Jasmine stood flanked by allies, no longer a solitary voice, but the center of a phalanx. AOC to her left, Pressley to her right, civil rights leaders behind her, and a governor standing tall at her side. Trump looked around, his swagger slipping under the weight of united opposition. For the first time, it was not just Jasmine versus Trump, it was democracy itself standing against the man who threatened to crush it. The cameras zoomed tighter, catching the moment as if engraving it into history. Jasmine's allies had turned the battlefield into a front line, and now the nation waited for the counterstrike, because the question was no longer if there would be a fight. It was, how far would each side go, and how much would America endure before the breaking point arrived? The chamber had become a storm. Shouts, gavel strikes, chants echoing against marble. Trump hunched over the desk, seething, his jaw tight, his eyes darting. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, deliberately, commanding silence not with volume but with presence. The room quieted, cameras tightening their focus. Every heartbeat felt like a drum roll, the anticipation unbearable. Then her voice cracked through the air, thunderous, raw, unflinching. "Mr. Trump, you're not protecting America, you're attacking it from within." The words hit like a detonation. For a second, stunned silence, then the chamber erupted into chaos. Democrats leaping to their feet, pounding the desks, cheering wildly. The gallery exploded in applause, tears, and chants. Even some Republicans shifted uneasily, their faces betraying doubt. The standing ovation rolled like a wave, impossible to suppress. Reporters scrambled, their headlines blazing onto screens within minutes. Crockett's killer line stuns Trump. Trump's face twisted, his lips parting to speak, but the sound was lost in the roar of approval. The gavel pounded uselessly. Order, order. But the chamber no longer belonged to rules. It belonged to the moment, and the moment belonged to Jasmine Crockett. She stood firm, chest rising, eyes blazing, her hand gripping the Constitution she had carried to the floor like a weapon. The true danger to America isn't Chicago's streets. It's a president who thinks he can rule above the law. It's a man who confuses fear for leadership, who tears at the very fabric of our democracy while pretending to defend it. Her words cut sharper than steel, slicing straight into Trump's myth of invincibility. The ovation swelled, people chanting her name, her line spreading instantly across social media. Hashtag attacking from within trended within minutes. Memes, videos, reaction clips flooded every platform. Americans repeated her words in bars, in classrooms, in living rooms, as if they had been waiting for someone to say it aloud. And then, like a crack of lightning splitting the storm, Aid rushed into the chamber, pale-faced, clutching a manila folder. Reporters noticed first, their eyes narrowing, cameras pivoting. The chair tried to wave the aide back, but it was too late. The document slipped into the hands of a journalist, flashed onto screens before staffers could intervene. The headline, ripped through the chamber like a blade. Leaked Pentagon memo discusses troop deployment to Chicago. Gasps cut through the air. Phones buzzed across the gallery. News anchors broke into live coverage as the leaked pages appeared online. There, in black and white, the possibility Jasmine had warned about: active duty soldiers, military convoys, the blueprint of an occupied city. Trump's eyes darted, his hand tightening on the desk, but the cameras were merciless. The fear Jasmine had spoken of was no longer abstract, it was documented. The chamber descended into pandemonium, shouts, panic, fury colliding in a storm that no gavel could contain. Jasmine stood frozen for a heartbeat, her killer line still echoing, her prophecy already confirmed. And as the nation stared at the leaked memo glowing on their screens, a darker question took hold, one that no one could turn away from. What would you do if your president turned the army against you? The leaked memo spread like wildfire, its pages plastered across every news ticker, every phone screen, every headline in America. The evidence was damning: direct discussions inside the Pentagon about deploying active duty troops, not for public safety, but to shore up Trump's political grip. Each line of bureaucratic jargon screamed one truth: this wasn't about Chicago. It was about power. The chamber quaked under the weight of revelation. Lawmakers shouted over one another, cameras zoomed on the president, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as though he could crush the truth by force alone. His voice, hoarse yet defiant, roared above the din. "I will not be stopped. I am the president. And if I decide troops go in, then troops will go in." The words rang out like the last stand of a cornered animal, ferocious but desperate. Jasmine slammed her fist against the table, her voice cutting through his fury. "This isn't strength, it's fear. You were caught red-handed. The memos prove it. You plotted to use America's soldiers not to defend us, but to control us. That's not leadership. That's treason against the very oath you swore." Gasps ripped through the chamber, the word treason detonating like a bomb. Reporters bolted for the exits, rushing to file the line that would dominate every front page by morning. Trump's face contorted, his eyes flashing with rage, but his bravado faltered. The cameras caught at the quiver in his jaw, the sweat beating at his temple, the unmistakable shadow of panic. For the first time, it was not Jasmine who looked on trial. It was him, The chamber thundered with noise, applause, boos, chants. Colliding into chaos, the gavel pounded uselessly, but the sound was drowned in history being written. Trump hunched forward, barking into the microphone, "I will not yield. Not to Congress, not to the media, not to anyone." But the roar no longer carried the weight of power. It carried the stench of desperation, and as the leaked memos flashed across every American screen, one truth became inescapable. The walls were closing in. The question now wasn't whether Trump could be stopped, it was how far he would go before dragging the country down with him. The chamber was chaos, papers scattered, voices clashing, cameras flashing when Jasmine Crockett suddenly rose. She didn't shout at first. Instead, she reached beneath her desk and pulled out a leather-bound copy of the Constitution, the same one she carried into every fight. For a heartbeat, the room stilled, eyes fixed on the small book in her hand. Then she slammed it down on the table with a crack that echoed like a gunshot. The chamber froze, her voice exploded. This is America's shield. Every word in here is meant to protect our people, to guard us from kings, tyrants, and yes, even presidents drunk on power. And you, Mr. Trump, are trying to burn it." The words reverberated through the marble hall, shaking even those who had laughed moments before. Gasps broke from the gallery, the weight of history thick in the air. Trump's face turned crimson, his hands trembling as he gripped the microphone, yet his mouth curled into defiance. "I'm not burning anything," he growled. "I'm saving this country from chaos." But his voice cracked at the edges, betraying the quake beneath the bluster. His shoulders heaved, sweat glistened under the lights, his composure slipping like sand through clenched fists. Jasmine leaned in, her eyes locked on him like a predator to its prey. "Chaos isn't in Chicago's streets. Chaos is right here in a White House that treats the Constitution like scrap paper. You think troops will silence us? You think fear will bind us? No, it only makes us louder, stronger, unbreakable." Her words weren't just an argument, they were a declaration, a vow carved into the floor of Congress for generations to come. And then silence. Not the nosy silence of outrage, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of a nation staring into its own reflection. Every gavel strike stopped, every whisper died. The camera zoomed closer, catching Trump's chest heaving, his jaw clenched, his eyes betraying that rarest of emotions, not rage, but fear. Jasmine placed her hand on the Constitution, steady, resolute. "This is not yours to destroy, this belongs to the people. And I swear before this nation, before history itself, I will not let you tear it apart." The silence deepened, thicker than any roar, more damning than any insult, and as millions watched from their screens, one truth became impossible to deny. This was no longer politics. It was survival. The chamber was suffocating with tension. The leaked memos, the testimonies, the Constitution slammed on the desk, it had all piled onto Donald Trump like a mountain he could no longer climb. His face was beet red, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale, sweat dripping down his temple. His words, once thunderous, now stumbled out like broken glass. This is fake. I'm the president, I decide." The roar of his voice was gone. What remained was a man cornered, gasping for control, that was slipping away in front of millions. The camera zoomed closer, catching the twitch in his eye, the flicker of panic that even he couldn't hide anymore. For the first time, Trump wasn't dictating the narrative, he was drowning in it. Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, her presence commanding every corner of the chamber. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind of silence that swallows a room before history is made. She placed her hand once more on the Constitution lying open on the desk, and her voice rang out like a bell, clear, merciless, unforgettable. "History won't remember your excuses, it will remember your crimes." The words detonated like dynamite. Gasps ripped through the chamber, some lawmakers shouted in fury, others broke into applause. The gallery erupted with chants, their voices rising like a chorus. "Crimes, crimes, crimes." Outside, the media exploded, every network cutting to breaking news, every chyron flashing with Jasmine's words. Crockett accuses Trump of crimes against the Constitution. Trump slumped back into his chair, his chest heaving, his eyes darting wildly as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. The swagger, the insults, the bravado, all of it had collapsed under the weight of undeniable truth. What remained was a cornered figure, trembling before a nation that had just seen him stripped bare. Jasmine stood tall, her voice carrying through the uproar like the verdict of a jury. This is not the end. This is the beginning. And the question now is simple. Will America hold him accountable? The chamber quaked once more, but this time it wasn't chaos, it was history breaking open. And as the cameras cut to black, one question seared into the minds of millions of Americans. Should Donald Trump face trial for violating the Constitution? The morning after the hearing, America was unrecognizable. City streets that had been quiet only days before now pulsed with fury and defiance. From New York to Los Angeles, crowds surged into public squares, carrying signs that read "Defend the Constitution" and "No tanks in our streets." In Washington, thousands gathered outside the Capitol, their chants shaking the steps where history had just been written. But it was Chicago that became the epicenter. Tens of thousands flooded Grant Park, waving both American flags and handwritten posters with Jasmine Crockett's words, "History will remember your excuses. It will remember your crimes." The crowd roared in unison, their voices rising into the cold night air, transforming grief into resolve, anger into movement. Helicopter shots broadcast the sea of humanity across every network. For once, the nation's eyes weren't on Trump, they were on the people standing with Jasmine. Media coverage fractured along predictable lines, it burned with unprecedented intensity. MSNBC called it the Crockett moment, a seismic turning point in American democracy. CNN described it as the most explosive congressional hearing in modern history. Meanwhile, Fox News dismissed it as political theater, but even they could not ignore the leaked Pentagon memos splashed across their screens, proof too glaring to bury. Social media roared with life. Hashtags climbing at lightning speed. Hashtag Crockett moment. Hashtag defend democracy. Hashtag no dictators. Memes spread like wildfire. Trump punched in collapse juxtaposed against Jasmine slamming the Constitution like a gavel. TikTok clips of her killer line hit millions of views in hours, teenagers mouthing her words as if she were a cultural icon, not just a congresswoman. Inside living rooms and diners, Americans argued, cried, and debated with a raw urgency not felt in decades. To some, Jasmine had become a hero. To others, Trump's defiance was still strength. But for everyone, one thing was undeniable: the country had been shaken to its core. And as night fell, with protests still raging and helicopters circling overhead, the world waited for what would come next, because Jasmine Crockett had given America not just a moment, but a choice that now demanded an answer. Would this be remembered as the night democracy fought back or the night it slipped through our fingers? The roar of the crowd, the chaos of the chamber, the headlines screaming her name, it all faded into silence when Jasmine finally stepped into her office alone. For the first time in hours, the weight of history gave way to the weight of exhaustion. She sank into her chair, the Constitution still in her hands, its leather cover worn smooth from years of battles. Her fingers traced its edges as if it were both shield and anchor. Her reflection stared back at her from the darkened window, eyes burning, shoulders heavy, but unbroken. She whispered to herself, almost too quietly for even the walls to hear. Courage, sacrifice, the price of truth. Words she had lived, words she had bled for, but never had they felt more real than tonight. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was her mother. Jasmine hesitated, then answered. The voice on the other end trembled, equal parts pride and worry. "Baby, I saw it all. You stood tall, but I know the toll. Are you holding up?" Jasmine's throat tightened, tears threatening to break, but she steadied herself. "Mama, I'm fighting because our communities deserve more than fear. We've been ignored, silenced, dismissed for too long. Tonight wasn't about me. It was about every child who deserves a school instead of a siren, every mother who deserves a tomorrow without burying her son." There was silence on the line, then the softest reply. "Then keep fighting. Just don't lose yourself in the fire." Jasmine closed her eyes, letting the words seep into her bones. A tear slipped free, rolling down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. It was not weakness, it was proof that even warriors bleed. She looked again at the Constitution on her desk and straightened her spine. The protests outside grew louder, echoing through the glass as if the people themselves were whispering her name. She knew the storm was far from over, that the price of truth might demand more than she had left to give, but in that moment, one vow hardened within her: she would not stop. Not now. Not ever. And the question that lingered for every American watching her journey was as haunting as it was inevitable. When the fight for democracy asks everything of you, How much are you willing to give? The chamber that only hours earlier shook with chaos was now silent, every pair of eyes locked on Jasmine Crockett as she stepped to the podium. The Constitution rested in her hand, battered but unbroken, much like the woman who carried it. Cameras zoomed in, broadcasting her face into millions of homes across America and beyond. For a moment, she simply stood, letting the weight of history sink in. Her voice, steady yet filled with fire, rose above the silence. Democracy doesn't survive by accident, it survives because we defend it. Tonight, we defended it together. The words echoed like a hymn through the marble chamber. Lawmakers leaned forward, journalists froze mid-sentence, and in the gallery, ordinary citizens wiped tears from their eyes. She continued, her tone swelling with both steel and sorrow. Democracy is not a gift, it is a fight carried by mothers who bury sons, by leaders who risk their careers, by people who dared to stand when silence would be easier. And tonight, America stood. We said no to fear, no to lies, no to tyranny. The chamber erupted in applause, the sound ran thunderous. Some lawmakers rose to their feet, others bowed their heads in silent relief. In living rooms across the country, families clutched hands, some crying, some cheering, all feeling the gravity of the moment. It wasn't just a speech, it was a release, the collective breath of a nation that had teetered on the edge and, for now, had pulled back. Jasmine's eyes glistened, but her voice did not waver. Do not mistake this as the end. This is only the beginning. Our enemies are not only foreign, they sit in our highest offices when power matters more to them than people. But tonight proves something vital. We are not powerless. We are not voiceless. Together, we are unstoppable. The ovation was deafening. Nautairs, cheers, the sound of history being sealed in applause. Jasmine lifted the Constitution high above her head, the symbol of the fight that had nearly torn the country apart. Her final words struck like lightning, searing themselves into memory. The question, America, is this: will we learn from this moment or repeat our darkest mistakes? The silence that followed was not emptiness, it was weight, the heavy burden of choice. And as the cameras cut to black, the nation was left trembling, knowing the answer would shape its destiny. In the end, Jasmine's fight was not just about politics, it was about reminding us that democracy is fragile, and courage is the price we pay to protect it. Her voice showed that truth, no matter how threatened, can still pierce through fear. And if one woman can stand against overwhelming power, then so can we in our daily lives, whether it's speaking up for justice, defending someone who feels invisible, or refusing to bow to intimidation. The question now is yours. When the moment comes to defend what matters most, will you find the courage to stand? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.